Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Glam Bodybuilding, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about when progressive overload might not be the best thing for you to do. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because I do believe that as a natural bodybuilder, you need to progressively overload the muscle, meaning you have to put on some form of strength through some exercises in order to progress overall. That's basically the foundation of muscle growth, is putting on muscular strength and strength endurance. Now, whether you're putting on that strength with a 5 rep range or 10 rep range or 15 rep range, it's still an increase in strength. If you're doing 100 pounds for 15 reps and then you're doing 300 pounds for 15 reps, you have increased in strength, right? It's not based on 1 rep maxes, although that's the obsession. You know, that's where people get obsessed, and that's where they snap their shit up all the time and get injured and tear their pecs and ass cheeks and all the rest of it, right? So if you want to avoid injuries, I say stay away from the 1 rep maxes mostly. But this is something I thought was worth talking about. You know, this is the question: when is progressive overload working against you? Now, we all know that if you apply progressive overload to bench presses or squats or deadlifts or whatever, doing your main compound movements with multiple joints involved and so forth, that you are using the most efficient range of motion possible to avoid injury. The efficient dynamics, such as you're not flaring the elbows on bench press, right? You're trying to make sure that you're pushing with the delts and the chest, because if you start flaring the elbows, pec tears become a huge risk, right? They become a huge problem for most people when they're flaring their pecs. And I've had a lot of natural guys come on here and say when they tore their pec was when they were flaring the elbows and lifting maximal poundages. So we can agree that when you're doing powerlifting type of movements, you're trying to find the way that puts the least stress on the joint, but at the same time achieves the lift that you want. And that might be different range of motion for each person. If you're a powerlifter, you want to achieve a certain depth in your squat and so forth. But remember, your main goal is to make sure that you're not putting undue stress on the tendons and that you're using your body efficiently during these lifts, because you are using, for the most part, higher amounts of weight or higher intensity, as some people would put it. If you're working with 80 or 90% of your 1 rep max, or 75% even, you should train a little bit differently than if you're doing something that's 5% of your 1 rep max, because the risk of injury is way higher. And like I said, the body dynamics just change depending on what type of weight you're using. So when should you just not use progressive overload techniques, or at least not make them the foundation of what you're doing? The time that I would not make progressive overload my main foundation is when I'm doing isolation exercises, especially the risky type of isolation exercises. One of those exercises is preacher curls. A lot of guys, they try to use preacher curls and they try to do progressive overload and 7 or 8 rep sets, and they try to just constantly use heavy weight instead of just use a weight where they get a pump and they feel that mind muscle connection. They start to strain, and of course, preacher curls put a lot of stress on the bicep tendon, and you do see bicep tears all over Instagram happening during the preacher curl. There's a reason for this. It puts an exponential amount of stress on the elbow joint during the lower portion of the movement. So not only if your range of motion is not on point, say you're using too much range of motion, and if you combine that with too much weight, you are going to tear something or inflame up your elbows, which is why you also see guys running around the gym with elbow wraps and saying, geez, I have a bicep inflammation or something. Well, a lot of times these guys are bouncing off the joints on the bottom. Not always, but a lot of times that's what's contributing to it. Or they're doing chin-ups and they're locking the elbows at the bottom when they're doing pull-ups or chin-ups, and they're just hanging on the elbows, and then they get some sort of golfer's elbow or something like that. So these are contributing factors to that. So my point is that if you're using lighter weight, you're getting less stress on the elbow, but you're still getting an isolation and a fatiguing effect on the bicep. And perhaps a preacher curl would not be the main way that you would try to establish muscular strength. Maybe you have a safer movement, such as when you're doing barbell curls, but you're keeping the elbows back to keep some of the stress off the elbow tendons. That might be a better way to put on some strength in the biceps if you want to do some heavier intensities, right? Another example of this is Flies. I made the mistake of going too heavy on flies for a long time. They could do using 100-pound dumbbells, 115 sometimes, whatever. Of course, I do a hybrid type of fly, right, to keep some of the stress off the shoulder, which is smart, I would say. But something I've been doing lately is messing around with super light flies, because I noticed that flies don't necessarily agree with me. Sometimes I get a twingy feeling in the shoulder, or maybe it's not the best sort of experience in the delts or in the rotator cuff. But what I started doing is a light technique, basically just using super lightweight to rehabilitate the area. And what I found from doing so is that during certain isolations, which I know 100% you guys have found, that if you use heavier weight, you are incapable of isolating the muscle group you want. So for instance, if I use heavy weight during dumbbell flies on an incline, I'll notice that my shoulders and my rotator cuff will come in to really stabilize the joint, but my pecs don't necessarily get extra tension on there. It seems like more of the extra tension goes on the delts. But when I use lighter weight, it feels like my actual upper pec hits exhaustion. And that's really what you want as a bodybuilder, is that you want the muscle group that you're having trouble isolating during an isolation exercise. You want that muscle that you want to isolate to hit failure, not the other auxiliary muscles, which probably get lots of work throughout your training. So just looking at my physique, you could see that my shoulders are dominant. They get way more work. They don't need any extra work. My trouble is isolating that upper chest. So I found just grabbing 30-pound dumbbells on an incline and just doing multiple sets of volume at the end of my chest workout, where I've already done some heavy weight, is a great way to isolate that certain muscle group that I cannot isolate with heavier weight. If I do the same exercise with heavier weight, not only do I put more stress on the joint, but I'm not necessarily capable of isolating the muscle. So in this case, progressive overload would work against me, because I am more than capable of using heavier weight, but is it necessarily going to be stimulating the area I want and at the same time going up in strength, right? First priority has to be stimulating that area that you want to hit. So during isolation movements, sometimes you'll find that if you concentrate too much on progressive overload, it will work against you and therefore keep you from making gains. And that's really my point. So I'm definitely a progressive overload fan, but there's a time and place to use every technique. And if you're finding that you're doing an isolation exercise and you're either injuring yourself or you're just not capable of really isolating that area that you want to hit, try backing off on the weight, adjusting your technique, but backing off on the weight and going through the motions and concentrate on really squeezing that muscle, and then see what happens over the next month or so. Not only may you rehabilitate the area if it's injured or experiencing some sort of discomfort, but you may also notice that you get newfound muscle growth from a muscle being able to finally engage in the movement from the other muscles not being over-engaged, right? And those ones taking over. So yeah, I thought this was worthwhile sharing to you. It's rocket science, honestly. Elon Musk just called me the other day and asked me for some advice on a rocket stuff. So yeah, if you want rocket science advice, this is where you get it. Mountain. I'm just putting it out there, you know. My consultant fee is really reasonable, like $1 million an hour. Super reasonable. So thanks a lot for watching. If you need to get a hold of me, just go to naturalgallantbodybuilding.com, and thanks to the patient supporters, and take care for now.